From my accent, you would probably not think that I have enough Irish in me to get an Irish passport. But I actually do. And a few years ago, I became a naturalized American, which truly delighted me. It was wonderful. But despite all that, I did grow up in England. And when I was 7, my great-aunt Eileen, my mother's aunt, came to live with us, where we lived in a small seaside town in the north of England, in Blackpool. And everyone always said about my great-aunt Eileen, "Oh, Eileen is such a character." And at 7, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. But it sounded rather wonderful. So I decided I was going to be a character too, just like my great-aunt. Well, my great-aunt Eileen was born in the Isle of Man, and that's a small island between the northwest coast of England and Ireland. And like that island, her whole history was surrounded by Irish mist. You couldn't ever quite get hold of it. But I did know a few things about my aunt. I knew, for example, that she really liked dogs, and that she kept a large pack of very aristocratic, very highly strung Afghan hounds in a very small house. And then I knew that for a time she lived over here in America. And at one point, she had been the secretary to the editor of the New York Times. And then I also knew that in our family, my great-aunt Eileen had a reputation as a smuggler. I'm afraid it's true. One time, she managed to smuggle a talking parrot into the country in a large handbag. Well, you can imagine the conversation she had with the parrot before they arrived. She came by ship. "Polly, I don't want to hear another word until we're through customs. There will be no repeat of that dreadful incident that happened last week at Uncle Patrick's wake. There will be no squawking, no spitting, and no swearing. Do you understand, Polly?" And clearly Polly understood, and Polly obeyed, because my great-aunt never got into any trouble. But I knew my great-aunt Eileen long after her smuggling days were over. She was in the last few years of her life, and she was badly crippled with rheumatoid arthritis. So her feet were very misshapen. She couldn't fit into ordinary shoes, so she shuffled along in big brown carpet slippers with the help of a cane. But her mind was still really bright, and so was her great love of sports. Now, my great-aunt Eileen's favorite sport was wrestling. This was not the modern, flashy American wrestling. No. It was the much more benign, by comparison, English wrestling of the mid to late 60s. And my Aunt Eileen, she loved to watch on Saturday on television, and I loved to watch with her. I was entranced by those heaving, grunting warriors. There was Mick McManus, he was the baddie. He was the one everyone loved to hate. And then there was Ricky Starr. He was an ex-ballet dancer. He'd pirouette around the ring, completely flummox his beefy opponent, and then when the man was standing there in shock, he'd flip into the canvas, get him in a half Nelson, and win the match. But my favorites were the Royal Brothers. These were a good-looking, clean-shaven tag team. Now, somehow, my great-aunt Eileen had managed to befriend these wrestlers. So whenever they were fighting in the area, they would always come to the house to have a glass of sherry with Auntie, as they called her. Well, Bert was the older one. He was going bald, and when he wasn't wrestling, he was a hairdresser in Bolton. And then his younger brother was called Vic. He'd come into the house and he'd say, "Hello, Geraldine, nice to see you, good to see you again." And I'd think to myself, he remembers me. And he's pleased. In fact, he's delighted to see me. Vic was 21. He had curly blonde hair, he had blue eyes and big muscles, and I never told anybody. But when I was 10, I had such a crush on Vic. I would look at him as he was sipping his sherry, and I'd think, "Oh, Vic, don't get married. Wait for me. Wait for me." Well, one day, my great-aunt Eileen told me that she'd got tickets for the two of us to go and see the Royal Brothers fight at Blackpool Tower. Now, Blackpool Tower was really famous in the north of England in those days because it had a resident circus headed up by a clown called Charlie Caroli. But when that circus was on vacation, they would put a wrestling ring right in the middle of the big circus ring. And I'd been there before one time with my aunt. Well, my aunt, who really was a very respectable woman, despite the smuggling, in the middle of one of these matches, she turned into a yelling, screaming, hoyden. She was on her feet. She was shaking a stick at the referee and she was going, "Ref, can't you see what he's doing? Can't you see? Do you need glasses? Would you like my glasses?" And all over that circus ring, little old ladies were doing the same thing. White, pink and blue heads were bobbing like buoys in a storm, as their owners were yelling things like, "Hit him! Hurt him! Make him bleed!" And then I saw one woman who looked the spitting image of my religious education teacher, the one who just last week had taught us about Samson. But it couldn't have been her, because this woman was screaming, "Gouge his eyes out! Gouge his eyes out!" And then other people were screaming and yelling things that sounded terribly rude, but I wasn't quite sure what they meant. So this upcoming visit presented me with a bit of a problem, because I needed to find something to shout that was rude, but was not too rude. And I thought about this for days. Well, I found the solution in a really unlikely place. My parents had a hotel and restaurant called The Steward, and they'd got a new menu. And under starters, I saw devils on horseback, prunes wrapped in bacon. Ooh, I thought, that's it, that's perfect, that's what I'll shout. Well, the day came. The event started with lights, drama, and a strong whiff of the circus that had last been in this ring. Well, the opening matches went smoothly, and then it was the Royal Brothers' time. Well, the first part of the bout went smoothly, and then it happened. Mick McManus, the baddie, he was thumping Vic out of sight of the referee. Well, Bert, his brother, was doing everything he could to get over those ropes so he could touch him, so he could tag him, so he could take over, but he was too far away, he couldn't reach him. Well, the crowd was on their feet. They were screaming, my aunt was shouting. I knew this was my moment. I stood up, and with all the passion in my 10-year-old heart, I made my declaration. Get off him! You devil on horseback! "Oh," said my aunt. "That was good." "Oh," said her friends who were sitting all around. "Ooh, Eileen? Eileen, she's become a chip off the old block. She's become quite a character." I'd done it. Not only had I joined the wrestling sisterhood, but I'd become a character too, just like my great aunt. Well, the moment passed. We all sat back down in our seats. I was thrilled because I knew that I had not let my heroes down. The Royal Brothers won. I had been part of their victory, and victory tasted